So we begin this series in Exodus, and we are all keenly aware that immigration is indeed a hot topic these days, and our country is engaged in a serious and necessary immigration debate. There are a variety of positive and negative perspectives that are being espoused regarding immigration, the impact of immigration on the labor force, citizenship, illegal entrance. There's talk about a wall and terrorism. We hear the debate coming out with comments like there are too many immigrants coming to the U.S. We hear it that illegal immigrants taking away jobs. We hear that everyone who comes should learn to speak English. But we also hear comments that has helped the United States by having a variety of cultures and language, by the immigrants helping us grow as a nation. Susan Matter reflects this perspective when she writes, "Immigrants are perceived as taking away resources from the host country and threatening the integrity of the American fabric. And as a country, we have amnesia when it comes to the treatment of immigrants. We forget that we became who we are today because we are a people of immigrants." So there's no doubt that immigration is a hot button issue. And for many of us, that we have drawn our line in the sands. And I can assure you that in 1,600 words, we're not going to solve the immigration debate. But our hope during this Lenten journey is that we'll be focusing on some of the passages in the book of Exodus that will open our hearts and our minds, and that we can be attentive to what the Spirit is saying to us, working in us. But I want to first relieve all your anxiety. I have that much power. I promise you it will not take us as long as it took the Israelites to make it into the promised land. I sincerely promise you today it will not take us 40 years to work our way through this series. We'll be done in a few weeks, ending the Sunday before Palm Sunday. But I want us to start with this notion of hospitality. Because in our faith journey, hospitality was the response toward the stranger, or the alien, or the refugees, or the immigrants. And the Greek term that is often translated into English hospitality is a combination of two concepts. Philos, which is several words in the Greek meaning love. And the word philos usually means brotherly love, or to love like a brother or sister. And that's where we get the word of the city Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. The second word is xanos, which is rendered the word hospitality, which in the word hospitality, which really means strangers or immigrants. And that's where we get the word xenophobia, the fear of a stranger or immigrant. So when these two words are combined, hospitality is defined as one who loves the stranger like they love their brother or sister. And that's what it means biblically, the word hospitality. One who loves the stranger, the immigrant, the refugee, the vulnerable, like you would love your own brother or sister. That's what it means biblically. Now, in the book of Exodus, it's a great book. It records how the Israelites leave Egypt. It chronicles the prophet Moses, who led them out of the wilderness to Mount Sinai. They received the 10 Commandments in return for their faithfulness. It's where God gives them the covenant to build a temple, a tabernacle, in which God could come and dwell with them and be God. In the book of Exodus, we get what? The burning bush. We get those nasty plagues. We get the parting of the Red Sea. we get the 10 Commandments starring none other than the late, great, iconic film star Charleston Heston. And there's a variety of a bunch of stories in the first half of the book of Exodus. Great stories that we remember and we have heard throughout our journey as people of faith. Now, the second half, well, and to tell you the truth, the second half of the book of Exodus is boring. So we're not going to go there because I already bore you enough, so I don't need to bore you on top of boring you. So we're just going to focus on that first part of Exodus, and we're going to turn our attention to the first chapter and the first part of the chapter. And here's what I want you to notice. The beginning of Exodus, the beginning meaning the first 7 verses, center around children and the land. At the very beginning, 12 sons are listed. And it's foundational for us to understand that the future of Israel, the Israelites' future, depended on their flourishing. And they needed children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they needed a land. So their future depended on their flourishing. Now, what we do know also that is in the Old Testament, Egypt was often presented in a negative way. It's understood that Egypt was a symbol of oppression and opposition to the people of God. But not so true at this point in our biblical story. It's more important that Egypt is perceived as more positively. We may want Egypt to be the evil empire, but they are practicing this notion of hospitality, which makes room for the foreigner, the stranger, the alien to live and prosper in their midst. And Egypt's hospitality, and I want you to hear this, Egypt's hospitality provides a path for Israel to fulfill God's intention for their lives. Egypt's hospitality. They were welcomed as strangers and aliens and refugees and immigrants, and I'm confident to say that one of the major themes throughout this book of Exodus, and probably throughout our whole faith story, is that God is on the side of the stranger and the alien, the refugee, the widow, the children, the orphan, the poor, the vulnerable. And so 2 things I want you to get into your head before we move on is hospitality is critical, and that God is on the side of the stranger and the alien, the widow, the children, the vulnerable, the poor. Now, when we shift to that second half, that verse starts in verse 8, something seriously different is happening. There's a shift in tone and context. We discover that the law of hospitality was no longer being practiced in Egypt. On the one side, you have this Israelites becoming too numerous and posing a threat to the security of Egypt. And on the other side, we have a new dynasty to rule Egypt who does not know Joseph, did not welcome Joseph's family. He does not know Joseph. And knowing here in this context textually means more than being acquainted or being informed. It means a relationship of depth in which there is a commitment to those who are known and genuine concern for their welfare. So in not knowing Joseph, this new Pharaoh adopts a completely different strategy. Let us deal shrewdly with them. How one knows another has a profound difference of what one does to the other. And not knowing here leads to oppression, and the law of hospitality, the ministry of hospitality, is no longer relevant because it's not being practiced any longer in Egypt. So the pivotal verse is 9. Pharaoh got his people together. That meant he got his advisors, and they decided to do something. Pharaoh, the new one, Sounds the alarm. We're about to be overrun with strangers, and we need to fix the system to create a new and different strategy so that the Israelites won't take over. In effect, Pharaoh says, look, we got all these people, all these foreigners in our land, and they're multiplying, making things harder for us, and they're a dangerous threat, and we have to get rid of them. And whatever the regime is, whatever throughout history, when the regime wants to oppress a given group, it needs to define them as undermining force or danger or potential threat to overthrow the established order. So Pharaoh, he implements this concept and got everybody all worked up against the non-Egyptians. And Pharaoh begins to drive Egypt out of fear, not hospitality. Instead of searching for more inclusive ways that embrace the legitimate concerns of all, both Egyptians and aliens, Pharaoh falls back to this us versus them mentality. And so what happens? What does fear do? Fear leads to fortification. Now, you will not hear any argument from me. Our country has a right to enforce its own laws and protect its citizens. That's not the debate. Biblical hospitality is. That's the issue, because at our core, in our hearts, we are not servants of Pharaoh. We are followers of Christ. And I'll accept that there are a variety of ways to apply our Christian principles, but at our core, in our hearts, we are followers of Christ. And I don't think we want to end up being like Pharaoh. The kind of people who look out and say, if someone has a different accent or a different color or a different sexual orientation, then they must be dangerous and we have to fortify, do something different. Biblical hospitality, Christ-like living, is extending the blessing rather than voicing the curse. It is loving instead of hurting. So I read this story about a rabbi who once received a university professor in his home. The professor was there because he wanted to inquire about the rabbi's wisdom, but the professor talked all the time. The rabbi was gracious and welcomed the professor, and he began to serve the professor tea. And as he poured the professor's tea, he kept pouring it until it became full, and then he kept pouring where it overfilled. Now the professor watched the overflow with dismay until he could no longer resist himself. He said, "It's over full." He explained, "No more will go in it." And the rabbi responded, "Like this cup, you are also over full. You are over full of your opinions and your speculations and your thoughts and your desires. How can I show you unless you empty your cup first?" So if we are to begin this journey in Lent, if we are seriously called to embody the biblical ministry of hospitality, we need to empty our hostility, our suspicion, our judgments against the others, as well as our internal projections toward the strangers and the aliens and the refugees and the immigrants. Hospitality requires us to be willing to create an open, empty space in which the stranger can come and find themselves a place. And it is not our purpose to turn the stranger, who we perceive as an enemy, into one whom we can actually care for. Okay, we're not going to fix the immigration issue this morning. And I'll suggest that's not our responsibility. We are, however, invited to embody a ministry of hospitality. And that begins with little, everyday steps. It begins by emptying the hostility, the suspicion, the judgments against those who are different, and create a new space where the stranger can enter and find a place and a people who care about one another. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. We give thanks, O God, for your word. Let it live in us and help us to interpret it as we go throughout this week. Help us to be aware of your Spirit nudging us toward a ministry of hospitality toward one another. For indeed we do pray. Amen.